For years, Melissa Sue Anderson stayed quiet about what really happened behind the camera on Little House on the Prairie. Fans saw a picture of harmony, a family united under Michael Landon's leadership. But what Melissa witnessed, especially as she grew from child star to young woman, told a very different story. Because Michael Landon wasn't just a co-star, he was the force that controlled everything: the scripts, the tone, the image of the show itself. And when his perfectionism collided with Melissa's independence, their relationship began to crack in ways no one saw coming. Now, decades later, Melissa Sue Anderson has finally broken her silence. What she revealed about Landon's control, his contradictions, and the hidden tension that tore through the Little House set has shocked even longtime fans of the series. When Little House on the Prairie premiered in 1974, Melissa Sue Anderson was just 11 years old. She played Mary Ingalls, the oldest daughter of the wholesome frontier family that millions of Americans came to love. At first, she described the set as warm and welcoming. Michael Landon, who both starred in and produced the series, became the center of that universe. He was funny, generous, and protective. But beneath that charm, Anderson noticed something few others could see. Landon wasn't simply the star, he was the architect of everything. Every camera angle, every line of dialogue, every emotional beat passed through him. Landon's authority created order. The cast respected him, sometimes even feared him. Crew members said his attention to detail bordered on obsession. He expected everyone to work as hard as he did. And most days, that meant long hours in the heat, endless retakes, and little patience for mistakes. For a young actress like Melissa, it was both inspiring and intimidating. He pushed her to be better, but also demanded silence when she disagreed. There was no room for questioning direction. Landon knew what he wanted, and his word was final. As the seasons went on, the mood on set began to shift. What had once been a family atmosphere became a tight production machine. Landon's stress grew as ratings pressures mounted, and Melissa began to see a more complicated man behind the smile. He could be kind one moment, cold the next. When things went wrong, his temper showed. Yet because of his status as both actor and producer, no one dared to confront him. Even the adult co-stars deferred to his authority. For the younger cast, he was untouchable. Melissa's experience mirrored the growing pains of Mary Ingalls herself. As her character faced hardship, Melissa's off-screen world became one of increasing control and diminishing voice. Landon directed many of the episodes that defined Mary's journey: her blindness, her heartbreak, her resilience. But those performances, though critically praised, came at a cost. Anderson has since hinted that the pressure to meet Landon's exacting standards left her emotionally drained. There was no improvisation, no room for vulnerability beyond what he permitted. Still, she admired him. Even years later, she called him a genius, someone whose talent demanded respect. But she also learned that such power can isolate. Landon's drive to maintain perfection sometimes alienated those closest to him. Crew turnover grew and quiet murmurs spread about exhaustion and burnout, yet publicly everyone smiled. The illusion of the Little House family remained intact while behind the scenes the cracks widened. By the late 70s, Melissa had grown up. She was no longer the wide-eyed girl from season 1. She'd developed her own instincts as an actress, but that independence made things complicated. On a set where one man's vision ruled everything, even subtle resistance felt like rebellion. Her once close bond with Landon began to cool. She later admitted that by her teenage years, she started to pull back, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. Still, at that point, few could imagine how quickly everything would change. The show's success masked growing tension, and Landon's iron grip would soon turn from protective to suffocating. For Melissa Sue Anderson, the next few years would expose just how fragile their professional trust really was, and how power once admired could reshape the entire world of Walnut Grove. By the late 1970s, the friendly image surrounding Little House on the Prairie began to fracture. Melissa Sue Anderson, once the quiet prodigy of the cast, started seeing the show from the inside out. She wasn't a child anymore. She noticed the atmosphere changing, the jokes fading, the tension rising, and Landon's patience wearing thin. Behind the warmth of Walnut Grove, the real production had become a place of hierarchy and fear. Landon's leadership style shifted as his ambitions grew. The more control he gained, the less he tolerated resistance. Scripts had to sound like his voice. Scenes had to reflect his values. Melissa and her co-stars began feeling the weight of his vision. What had once felt collaborative now felt dictated. The same man who once laughed with them during breaks could, in the next hour, tear into a performance that didn't meet his expectations. Anderson later admitted that the pressure became constant, that every glance from Landon carried judgment. The cracks were subtle but real. When Melissa delivered emotional scenes, she could feel his eyes on her from behind the monitor. He rarely offered praise. Instead, he dissected her timing, tone, even her breathing. She wanted to please him. Everyone did, but the environment made it impossible to relax. Landon's perfectionism turned the set into a battlefield of small tensions. Crew members whispered about his temper, his exhaustion, and the impossible schedule he maintained. Yet no one dared to question him. Anderson wasn't alone in noticing the change. As other young cast members grew older, they too began testing boundaries. Landon saw it as ingratitude. He had built the careers of many, and he expected loyalty in return. But for Melissa, loyalty didn't mean silence. She began voicing her thoughts, questioning the emotional direction of scenes. That independence, rare for a teenage actress in that era, clashed directly with Landon's authority. According to several former crew members, there were days when their conversations grew strained. Melissa's growing maturity threatened the image Landon had of the cast as his extended family. He wanted control. She wanted authenticity. When those two forces collided, distance followed. Soon the warmth between them cooled. Publicly they remained professional. Privately, the trust that once defined their partnership began to erode. Even fans began noticing Melissa's reduced presence in later seasons. Storylines shifted, screen time shortened, and by the early 80s, her departure seemed inevitable. But few realized how deep the emotional toll ran. Anderson didn't leave in anger. She left in exhaustion. Years later, she described the experience as intense, a word that only hinted at what it felt like to work under Landon's unrelenting gaze. Still, she never denied his genius. Even after their connection fractured, she spoke of his brilliance as a storyteller. That was the paradox of Michael Landon. He inspired devotion and fear at the same time. For Melissa, the tension between admiration and frustration became impossible to ignore. And when she finally left Little House, she took with her not only memories of one of television's most beloved shows, but also the weight of lessons learned under the shadow of a man who demanded perfection from everyone, including himself. When Melissa Sue Anderson left Little House on the Prairie in 1981, it wasn't just another cast change, it marked the quiet end of an era, and the beginning of her separation from the man who had defined her career. Officially, her departure was described as a creative decision. Mary Ingalls' story had run its course, but insiders later revealed that tension with Michael Landon played a larger role than anyone admitted at the time. By then, Anderson had spent nearly a decade growing up on Landon's set. She had entered as a child, and left as a woman who had learned how power truly worked in Hollywood. Landon's production company ran the show with precision, but it also kept its cast in a constant state of dependency. He decided which stories mattered, who received attention, and how much emotion the camera should capture. When Anderson began voicing opinions, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, she crossed an unspoken line. On Little House, there was only one creative voice allowed to echo, and it belonged to Michael Landon. Her decision to leave came after months of friction. The show's focus had shifted to younger storylines, and Anderson's character appeared less frequently. Still, she sensed that her independence had unsettled Landon. He had guided her career from the start, and now he couldn't control its next chapter. To him, it felt like betrayal. To her, it felt like survival. She later described leaving the series as one of the hardest choices she ever made, because it meant stepping away from the only professional family she had ever known. Behind the scenes, crew members noticed the difference immediately. Without Anderson's calm presence, the cast chemistry changed. The show continued, but the balance that had once anchored the Ingalls family dynamic faded. Landon tried to fill that void by focusing on new characters and story arcs, yet the magic that once united the cast never quite returned. Anderson moved on, pursuing roles that challenged her, but she carried the Little House experience like a shadow. Hollywood was less forgiving outside the safety of Landon's influence. Casting directors still saw her as Mary Ingalls, the sweet, dutiful daughter. The same discipline Landon had drilled into her, perfection, precision, control, now made her cautious in a business that rewarded risk. Over time, her feelings about Landon grew complex. She respected his talent, but resented how his authority shaped her confidence. In later interviews, she said that while she owed him her start, she also had to unlearn many of his habits to find her own voice. Landon had trained her to trust the director above all else, but true artistry, she discovered, required trust in herself. Her silence after leaving Little House wasn't avoidance, it was reflection. For years, she avoided public criticism of Landon, even when others came forward about his temper or ego. She didn't want to reduce him to his flaws. But privately, she admitted that speaking up as a young actress had consequences. In an industry where child stars were expected to obey, asserting independence came with a price. By the time Michael Landon launched Highway to Heaven in the mid-80s, their communication had all but stopped. They were no longer teacher and student. They had become two professionals moving in opposite directions, one still commanding the spotlight, the other trying to redefine what success meant beyond it. And for Melissa Sue Anderson, that quiet distance said more than any interview ever could. When Little House on the Prairie finally ended in 1983, Melissa Sue Anderson was no longer part of the show, but she couldn't escape its shadow. The series remained a cultural cornerstone, and Michael Landon's reputation as a beloved television patriarch grew even larger. To the public, he was still Charles Ingalls, the man who stood for integrity and love. Yet those who had worked closest to him carried a more complicated picture, one that time would slowly bring into focus. In the years that followed, Anderson kept her distance. She focused on raising a family and pursuing occasional acting projects, carefully avoiding the nostalgia circuit that defined so many of her peers. Reporters often pressed her to talk about Landon, hoping for scandal or sentiment. Instead, she offered restraint. She acknowledged his creative brilliance, praised his work ethic, and credited him for teaching her discipline. But she also made clear that his control had limits, that working under him came with both opportunity and cost. As stories from the set began to emerge over the decades, a fuller image of Landon took shape. Former co-stars described him as generous but volatile, compassionate but exacting. Some remembered his laughter. Others remembered the tension that hovered when he entered a room. For Melissa, those contradictions became easier to understand with age. What once felt oppressive now looked like the burden of a man who carried too much. Landon wasn't simply a director or actor, he was a brand, one responsible for holding together an empire of expectations. When Landon passed away in 1991, Anderson didn't rush to the spotlight with statements or memoirs. Her silence was telling. While others spoke about forgiveness or nostalgia, she processed his death privately. Only years later did she begin to reflect publicly on their time together, describing him as both mentor and taskmaster. Her tone carried neither bitterness nor adoration, just truth. She saw him as a man who demanded control because he feared chaos, a perfectionist who couldn't always separate art from power. That honesty resonated deeply with audiences who had grown up with Little House. Many fans, especially those who had idealized Landon, found themselves grappling with a new understanding of him. Anderson's perspective didn't diminish his legacy, it humanized it. She reminded viewers that behind every legend lies a person shaped by insecurities, ambition, and need for approval. For Melissa, the lesson was lasting. The years she spent under Landon's authority taught her that greatness and flaw often coexist. She learned that leadership, when driven by fear, can create beauty but also pain. It took decades for her to reconcile those truths, but when she finally did, she did so without resentment. Her reflections became less about exposing Landon's faults and more about understanding how power transforms relationships. Time softened what tension once remained. By the 2000s, Anderson began participating in reunions and documentaries, speaking about Landon with balance rather than caution. She recognized his impact on television, on storytelling, and on her life. Yet, in every word, there lingered an acknowledgement of complexity, that his vision built something unforgettable, but his control left scars that took years to fade. In breaking her silence, Melissa Sue Anderson didn't rewrite history, she refined it. Her story became a mirror for countless actors who lived under similar systems, admiring their mentors, yet carrying the weight of their dominance. And through her candor, fans finally began to see Little House on the Prairie, not just as a piece of nostalgia, but as a reflection of how art, power, and humanity can intertwine in ways no one fully understands until the curtain falls. Decades after Little House on the Prairie ended, Melissa Sue Anderson finally spoke openly about Michael Landon's complex nature, his brilliance, his control, and the emotional cost of both. When she released her memoir The Way I See It in 2010, it wasn't a takedown. It was a measured, deeply personal account of growing up inside Landon's world, of seeing both the magic and the machinery behind America's most wholesome family drama. For the first time, she gave words to what so many had only guessed, that Landon's perfectionism shaped not just the show but everyone who lived within it. She wrote that Landon was meticulous, sometimes to the point of exhaustion, demanding absolute commitment from everyone on set. He worked longer hours than anyone else, but expected the same from his cast. To him, excellence justified the sacrifice. Yet for a teenager navigating fame and identity, that intensity could be overwhelming. Anderson described feeling grateful for his mentorship, but also stifled by his need to control every emotion and decision. It was admiration intertwined with frustration, a paradox that defined their working relationship. What made her words so powerful was their restraint. She didn't attack him, she humanized him. She wrote that Landon's energy could light up a room, but it could also darken it. He was generous, often protective of his cast, but when things didn't go his way, the air turned sharp. She recalled days when laughter filled the set, followed by sudden silence when his temper flared. Those shifts, she said, taught her early that leadership carried danger when it blurred with ego. For Anderson, the years of distance helped her see the man behind the myth. She came to believe that Landon's need for control came from insecurity, an inability to let go of the perfection he built for himself. He carried the weight of being everyone's hero, actor, writer, producer, father figure. That kind of pressure, she realized, leaves little room for vulnerability. When he fell short of his own standards, he turned inward, becoming distant or irritable. The same drive that created beauty on screen created turbulence behind it. Even so, Anderson made it clear she felt gratitude. Landon gave her one of television's most memorable roles and shaped her professionalism for life. She admitted that despite the strain, she never stopped respecting him. He expected the best, she wrote, because he gave the best of himself, even when it hurt. Those words, simple yet piercing, summed up their complicated bond. When she finally broke her silence, fans expected anger. What they heard instead was perspective. Her honesty revealed the price of greatness, not the scandal behind it. She reminded the world that even legends can be flawed, and that mentorship can both build and bruise. Through her reflection, Michael Landon emerged not as a villain, but as a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his burdens. For Melissa, speaking out wasn't about rewriting history. It was about reclaiming it. She no longer saw herself as the quiet daughter of Little House, defined by someone else's story. She was an adult who had lived through the pressure, learned from it, and finally told the truth on her own terms. And in doing so, she gave fans something Michael Landon himself might have admired most: a story told with courage, compassion, and the full weight of experience. Melissa Sue Anderson's story is no longer about silence. It's about understanding. When she finally shared what working with Michael Landon was really like, she didn't diminish him, she completed him. Her reflections pulled back the curtain on a man who embodied both warmth and control, generosity and precision, compassion and pride. To the world, he was Charles Ingalls, the father everyone wished they had. But to those who worked beside him, he was also a man consumed by the pursuit of perfection, constantly trying to live up to his own impossible standards. Anderson's voice gave balance to a legacy that had long existed in extremes. She didn't want to undo the admiration fans felt for Landon. She wanted to show that greatness and imperfection often share the same space. His talent built one of the most enduring shows in television history, but it also demanded sacrifices from those around him. For Melissa, the lesson wasn't about resentment, it was about recognition. She learned that authority, even when born from genius, can easily blur into control. And she learned that silence, while safe, can also erase truth. In speaking out, she reframed her own role in the Little House legacy. No longer the quiet eldest daughter who carried her lines with poise, she became the adult who could finally speak from experience. Her honesty brought closure not only to her story, but to the collective memory of an entire generation of viewers who grew up idolizing Michael Landon. Through her words, audiences were reminded that behind every story of perfection lies a struggle, sometimes hidden, sometimes painful, always human. Today, when fans revisit Little House on the Prairie, they see more than the simplicity of frontier life. They see the layers behind its creation, the people who lived those roles, the man who shaped them, and the young actress who grew up brave enough to tell what really happened. Melissa Sue Anderson's account doesn't tarnish Landon's legacy, it enriches it, allowing admiration to coexist with truth. Her silence once protected him. Her honesty now honors him, because by revealing the complexities of the man behind the myth, she reminded the world that even the brightest stars cast shadows, and that understanding those shadows doesn't dim the light, it helps us see it more clearly. For more emotional stories, check out this video.